then we'll just bring a mic to you. We really love our live questions, so we encourage that. And then we'll also have a Slido. So there will be a link for that, the Slido. You can use the QR code, type in the code, and there you can enter your questions while the speaker is talking. You can upvote other people's questions that seem interesting to you. So definitely take advantage of that as well. And then without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Our speaker is Abdu Murray. He is not only a seasoned speaker, he is also a lawyer with a degree from the University of Michigan Law School. He's also written a book that actually we have available for you outside after the talk. It's called More Than a White Man's Religion. And on the personal side, he grew up Muslim. After years of investigating, he became Christian later in life. And so he's definitely given a lot of thought about the evils that have been tied to people's perception of Christianity, and that'll inform the talk for tonight, Is Christianity Dangerous and Delusional? So let's everyone please welcome Abdu Murray.
Well, thank you so much, Cher, for that introduction. Thank you, Chris, and your team for hosting me here. It's truly a privilege and an honor to be addressing you here at one of the most storied and impressive institutions in the world. It doesn't quite feel real sometimes when you come to a place like this and you think to yourself, I'm literally the dumbest guy in the room at a place like this, and yet here I am with a microphone attached to my ear. So thank you so much for giving me a hearing. I have no illusions that the food helped apply you to get you here. I will say this, I'm Lebanese, and the food you're eating is Lebanese. So right now I'm smelling the aromas of home. I'm quite homesick just from the aromas. But I'm also reminded that if there is in fact a heaven, this is very similar to, if not identical to, the food that Jesus ate. And so if you don't like this food and you are someone who goes to heaven, it's going to be a long, long journey. My name is Abdu Murray. It's tremendous to be with you all. I want to speak, if I can just kind of jump into it, if you don't mind my doing so, on this topic of dangerous and delusional. Is Christianity really good for the world? And as I think about this, I've spoken at universities all over the world. Some right here in America, over in Canada, overseas in Asia and other places. And what I've noticed is something over the past few years. Few years dating even pre-COVID, because COVID had this effect of making us say, 2 years ago, we meant 4 years ago, because that 2 years seemed to not actually happen. But I've noticed something about the way that the questions have shifted, the way things have changed in terms of the emphasis on questions. You go to a university, you go to a place of higher learning of various stripes, whether are technical colleges or places that are more on the liberal arts side, and the questions used to be very factual based. It'd be propositional questions. Was Lysanias really tetrarch of Abila, as Luke says in the beginning of his gospel? Didn't scholars disprove that Lysanias wasn't in fact tetrarch when Jesus was born? Luke got the date wrong. What about King David? Is there any evidence for King David? How about this whole thing about science and evolution? Hasn't this put God out of a job? Questions like this were the primary questions, and they're still the questions that are being asked. But they're no longer the primary questions in culture. What I've noticed is something of a profound shift, is that now when I go to a university, oftentimes, and in various places, not just universities, but other places as well, halls of government, business, churches even, and youth groups, the questions are still asked that I just mentioned. But the primary questions, oftentimes on the hearts and minds of people, is questions like this. Isn't Christianity an inherently racist ideology based on the texts of the Old and New Testaments? Isn't belief in God a delusional thing, and doesn't it actually force us to classify women as second-class citizens based, again, on the texts of the Old and the New Testaments? These are the questions. Is it racist? Is it sexist? Is it something phobic? You take gender, ethnophobic, homophobic, whatever it might be. Isn't it this kind of an ideology that spreads all kinds of fear and hate of the other? These are the questions, and so what you'll notice is that oftentimes in culture, the questions have shifted away from is Christianity true to is Christianity good? The other ones are being asked, but the primary questions are moral questions. They're primarily moral questions. Now, this has created something of a cottage industry of people who are criticizing Christianity and writing best-selling books that do the job. And you think of someone like a Richard Dawkins, for example, out of Oxford University, one of the world's most famous, not necessarily the world's most prominent in terms of the philosophical thinking. He's a prominent scientist, but there are prominent atheist philosophers who outstrip him in terms of their analyses. But he's definitely one of the most famous atheists in the world, and he calls on God as being, the God of the Bible especially, as a malevolent, pestilential, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, ethnic cleansing bully. You know, not exactly the most glowing terms in reference to what the Bible says about God. So there's this sense in which it's bad, but there's also this sense in which it's a delusion. So you have someone like Dawkins who points out in his book, The God Delusion, he says, a delusion is a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence, especially as a symptom of a psychiatric disorder. Then he goes on to say this, God is a delusion and a pernicious delusion. There's the good, is it good, pernicious, and the is it true, the delusional. He says God is a delusion and a pernicious delusion. When one person suffers from a delusion, it's called insanity. When many people suffer from it, it's called religion. Now that's a pretty hefty statement. That's a great sort of argument by meme, as it were, which is sort of what the culture does nowadays. You know, we don't argue in terms of argumentation. We just post a favorite meme. We cast aspersions at some belief, whether it's ours or someone else's, and we think that settles the matter. But not to be outdone in terms of bumper sticker argumentation, there's this line from Victor Stenger. Now, it's attributed to Victor Stenger. I don't know if he's the one who said it or not, but it's this interesting thing, and it talks about the whole idea of not whether it's just delusional, but whether it's dangerous or not. Victor Stenger is quoted as saying that science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings. Now, that is an indictment. The question is that really true? Religion in general, you know which religion he's talking about, obviously, because of the past events of the past 20-something years now. But I think he's willing to apply that to all religions, including and especially Christianity. Now, some of this is actually warranted. Some of this is actually kind of warranted, not in terms of the belief system itself, and I want to sustain for you in the time we have, that the Christian faith, when properly understood, not only in the context of the words of the Bible, but also in the lens of the life of Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure, doesn't actually warrant the things that are against it. However, Christendom, that's a different statement. Christendom as an expression of human beings trying to actually live or take advantage of and manipulate the message of the Christian faith, that's got plenty of pockmarks in its history. Its face is blemished with quite a few of those blemishes and earned, as it were. Let me tell you about when I went to Charleston, South Carolina, not too long ago. Charleston, South Carolina is this wonderful tourist spot. People go there oftentimes, but it's incredibly historical. One of the reasons it's incredibly historical is because that's where the Civil War started. The war where the central issue was the ending of a barbaric practice where people could own other people as property based solely on their race. It started there. Now, if you go to Charleston, South Carolina, you'll be told something. If you ask about the way in which the ordinances work, and I'm a lawyer, so I kind of want to know how the laws work whenever I go to this place. Turns out, there's an ordinance in Charleston, South Carolina, where no building can be built higher than the highest steeple of the tallest church. So no building can ever exceed the cross that sits atop a steeple at the highest church in all of Charleston, South Carolina. So the church is held quite literally in the highest of regard. Quite literally, the highest place in the place is the church, is the idea of Christianity. So the same place that harbors this wonderful sort of vaunting of the Christian faith is also the same place, when that ordinance was in place, is the same kind of a town that had a slave market. So you ask yourself, how do you reconcile these two ideas? How is it possible to have this admiration for a faith, like the Christian faith, that seems to advocate for the fairness, equality, and beauty, and God's image being an indelible thing on all people, yet is also the same exact place where they sold people as property? And it leads one to ask the question, is it in fact good if it were the people who claim to be Christians who had no problem with a slave market existing in their town? It's a tough thing, you know. It's a tough thing. And you look at, From race, you go over to sexism and misogyny. And some of the worst perpetrations of that have been at the hands of people who would call themselves clergy. And you ask yourself, if they really do believe that Adam and Eve were created in God's image, as Genesis 1:27 says, then how is it possible that people will often denigrate someone and make them a lower-class, second-class citizen, as the Me Too movement actually showed, not just existing in secular society, but in the religious world as well? How can we justify this? Then you come to the question of sexuality and various things, whether it's trans or homo or LGBTQ phobic, whatever it might be, and you ask the question, people who claim to value other people, no matter what it is they believe or say, you don't have to agree with it, but they at least value those people. Is the history of Christendom really marked by a sense of valuing other people, even if you disagree fundamentally with what they believe and what they actually practice in their life? And some of that is earned. Some of that bad press, as it were, when it comes to the Christian faith, some of that is earned based on the way in which we've actually acted. So what I want to do in the time we have before we engage in a Q&A, and I hope we can engage as much live Q&A as possible. If someone holds the mic and we begin to talk to each other, we're going to explore some of these questions. I'm going to do it in some prefatory remarks here, hopefully some remarks of substance that will generate some questions, but I really want to engage with you, because hopefully by the time this is over, you'll see that we haven't actually engaged in answering questions. We've actually engaged in talking to each other. We've actually engaged in answering people, because the Apostle Paul says in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, he says something really remarkable. He says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt." And I hope I can do that for you tonight. And then he says, "So you may know how you ought to answer each person." He doesn't say answer each question. He's not afraid of the questions, but what Paul is saying is that you don't answer questions, you answer people, because questions don't need answers, but people do. They use their questions to get them, and so hopefully by the time we're done, you'll have felt that you, in fact, were answered. You might not agree on the answer, but hopefully you and I will engage in a way that respects each other as people who are equally made in God's image, from my end at least. So let's move on to the delusional part of it and see whether or not this is actually delusional. Now, this is an interesting thing to me because there's an irony here. When one claims that science flies you to the moon, but religion flies you into buildings, there's an obvious, I think, categorical mistake being made here, or at least some kind of a generalization fallacy that's being made, is that religion doesn't do anything, and science doesn't do anything. Science is a method. Scientists do things. People who use science will do things, either use it for good or use it for ill. We can create vaccines that cure previously incurable diseases and ravaged entire countries, or we can create biological weapons. So science does a lot of things, good and bad. It's what people do with it that matters. Religion has fostered the advent of hospitals. It was religious people who started, specifically Christian people, who started hospitals all over the world. The very concept of hospitals was started by Christians. Yet, they're also guilty of some things like the Inquisition and the Crusades. So it's not the institutions themselves, it's the people who use them. Now the question is whether or not those institutions lend themselves to this kind of evil. But the irony I want to point out is this. God makes sense of human rationality and the whole idea of the scientific endeavor in the first place. God makes sense of the idea of human rationality and the whole endeavor of science in the first place. That's what's ironic here, is to call belief in God a delusion suggests that there is a standard of rationality by which we can judge God to be a delusional idea or religion to be delusional in the first place. It suggests and it assumes the standard, an objective standard by this. Now, the reason I say this is a problem, or at least an irony here, is because if there is no, I think, intelligibility to the universe that's born of an intelligence, then all of these things seem either arbitrary or they're the kind of things that are just almost deterministic. You know, if you're just a biochemical machine or a sophisticated chimp, depending on which way you look at it, or one of both, everything you do, everything you think is basically based on your atoms and therefore the neurotransmitters in your body and your neural network and all these things just being a certain way that results in you reacting to external stimulus in a way that you're wired for. So you might believe in God because you're wired to believe in God, and you look at evidence a certain way, and because of your wiring, you'll believe it that way. You might not believe in God, but if you're just a biochemical machine, your lack of belief in God doesn't have anything to do with reason or a lack of evidence. It has to do with the way you're wired. So you don't know if it's true or not, it just happens to be. But science as an endeavor is the effort to make sense of the physical world or the natural world by collecting evidence, observing it, testing it against hypotheses or creating hypotheses to test things against, and then taking those and drawing rational inferences based on the data collected, either revamping what you're thinking and changing things to see what the data actually bears out. There's an instance of actual free will involved. You have to be able to make inferences, and if you're just a random collocation of atoms, as Bertrand Russell has famously said, and if you're just a neural network of things that respond to external stimuli, as Sam Harris is famous for saying, then you don't actually make rational inferences. In fact, the people who are telling you that the data shows that you are a collection of atoms and neurotransmitters, they did that based on rational inferences, and they can't have rational inferences unless there's something beyond merely the physical. And I think God makes better sense of that than anything else. Listen to the words of someone like Raymond Tallis. Raymond Tallis is a neurologist and an evolutionist and a philosopher, and he wrote this amazing book called Aping Mankind, where he basically, as an atheist, by the way, takes to task the idea that we can explain human rationality and human emotion and morality merely by Darwinism, which he calls Darwinitis. And he's a Darwinist, by the way. He says this idea that Darwin can explain everything is Darwinitis. Or this idea that we can explain everything through neuroscience, he calls it neuromania. He's saying there's got to be more to it than this. As an atheist, he says that. This is what he says. It is a bitter irony that two of our greatest intellectual achievements, the theory of evolution and neuroscience, should be used to prop up a picture of humanity that is not only wrong, but degrading. I feel the misuse of bioscience all the more acutely since I have been a biologist of sorts all my life, a doctor and clinical scientist, and my research has been in the field of neuroscience, where I have seen huge advances that have amazed and inspired me. Now listen to this. The biologistic image of humans, in other words, the simple idea that human beings are simply biology and that's all they are. The biologistic image of humans effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility, of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorize about evolution or to develop neuroscience. This is a great line. If on the origin of species really were the last word on humanity, it could not have been written. And if our consciousness were totally explained by brain science, we would have no brain science to explain it. I find that remarkable that he's willing to make that concession in a book where he makes the entire case that a biologistic and simply naturalistic explanation of how we got our ability to think in the first place fails. Not to be outdone, Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy at New York University, in his book Mind and Cosmos, and in various other places, has made the exact same point, that you can't actually get the very faculties that make us higher than mere animals simply from evolution or from a naturalistic framework of life. And he says an account of their, meaning human beings, biological evolution must explain the appearance of conscious organisms as such. Since a purely materialist explanation cannot do this, the materialist version of evolutionary theory cannot be the whole truth. Now, neither of these men believe in God. And both of these men would tell you that there's got to be some kind of a thing that we're missing in the whole entire endeavor, but neither of them actually know, because Thomas Nagel, after spending 346 pages or so telling you that neither Darwin nor neuroscience can explain human rationality or human ethics and emotion, he says this at the end of it. He says, so Dr. Tallis, you have told us and you have convinced us that neither of these two things are the explanation for what amounts to human rationality. What do you offer as an explanation? And his anticlimactic answer is this: I don't know, and no one else does either. Sort of a disappointment at the end of this wonderful book. I highly urge you to read it, by the way. It's interesting because you look at the Psalms, and there's provided an answer there. Or you look at the Proverbs, you have this question in the Psalms, what is man, O God, that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the angels, than the heavenly beings, and yet you crowned him with glory. See, there's this careful balance that's understood in the Christian faith, that human beings aren't just biological machines. We are, in fact, biological. The body matters, and it's important, it's central. That's why the resurrection of Jesus wasn't just a spiritual event, it was a physical event, because the physical body matters. But that's not all we are. There's more to us than that. We are made a little less than the heavenly beings. There's a spiritual aspect to us that doesn't make us God, but doesn't make us mere sophisticated chimps. There's something actually rational and beautiful about each one of us. And that's what makes these entire ideas about ethics and value and the scientific method itself possible in the first place. And you see this as you begin to explore the world around you. And some of the most important scientists in modern history not only were inspired by their Christian faith to pursue those sciences, or inspired by their faith in God to pursue those endeavors. When you look at the classics, whether it's Newton and Galileo and Tycho Brahe and all these folks, even Einstein himself, who at some point had said, look, there's intelligence in this universe either baked into it or is the origin of it that only the most humble mind would recognize. It has to be behind it because our finite minds can't seem to grasp it. You have all of this, and you begin to see in the creation of the universe, whether it's from a standard cosmology of the universe had a beginning at a finite point in the past, where all matter, energy, space, and time began to exist. And if you think about it for a moment, since it's ludicrous to say that things can create themselves because they have to pre-exist themselves to create themselves, that matter, energy, space, and time can't create themselves. And so what has to create matter, energy, space, and time? An immaterial, enormously powerful, spaceless, and timeless cause. And that sounds dangerously close to what God sounds like. And then you look at the biology in you and me, and you begin to see something I think remarkable, is that there is an intricacy to our creation. Whether it's DNA at 3.1 billion bits of information in the DNA strand, and yes, only 4% of DNA encodes for proteins, but through the ENCODE project and others, we're beginning to see this emergence of function in the so-called junk DNA that actually allows the other 4% to do their job in the first place. We're seeing this. We're seeing the intricate dance of things we once thought were just vestiges of an evolutionary blind process, but actually look to be some kind of a functional quality to it, to the knitting together of what it means to be a fully functional human. Let me close this section and move on to the dangerous section by just a simple personal story. You know, I think biology points to the design of human beings, to all life, but human beings in particular. I think the cosmos points to that. Now, the Bible doesn't say, though, that you're built. It doesn't say you're constructed. It doesn't say you were designed and rolled off a line, like a factory machine or something like that, or some kind of piece of machinery that does an amazing thing. No, it doesn't say that. Psalm 139 has an amazing statement, and it says that you were knit together in your mother's womb. Now, when I say knit, I say that word, what do you think of? One of the first things you think of is a grandmother or an aunt, something like that, who's doing the cross, loop, stitch, whatever you do when you knit. I have no idea. But when someone's doing that, yes, this is the design. This is a template. But there's an intimacy to the whole process. There's an intimacy to that knitting when you're taking your fingers and you're using those needles to do whatever it is they do when they knit. There's an intimacy to the whole process. It's not a manufacturing process. Yes, something is made, but there's something of heart in the whole thing. And the Bible uses this word knit very specifically. You know, I'm from Michigan and you guys live in Massachusetts, and you guys know the importance of sweaters. Or at least sweatshirts or hoodies or whatever it is people wear nowadays. I have sweaters. I'm a sort of a dork, I suppose. But I have sweaters. Now, some of them have monetary value. I bought them. Some of them have sentimental value because they were given to me as gifts. There's one sweater in my home that is completely useless, and yet it is the most valuable thing in my home outside of my children and my wife and my wedding ring. The most valuable thing I have is this little purple sweater that doesn't even fit on my right hand. That's how small it is. The reason it's that small is because when my mother was pregnant with me, She was knitting that sweater. I was born in February. She was knitting that sweater to bring me home from the hospital in that little purple sweater. And when she did that, knit from a design, from a template, but with me in her mind, swelling her belly, she said, "My boy, my son, Abdu." I brought home all 3 of my kids from the hospital in that same purple sweater. There's an intimacy in the whole endeavor. So science is something that points to what Peter Berger called, in this beautiful crystalline phrase, the signals of transcendence. It can't prove it, but it can point to it. And so the whole idea is that we have this wondrousness in our creation that goes beyond merely the physical, but the physical points to that wondrousness. And I think of Joseph Plunkett's poem, I see his blood upon the rose. It's so wonderful because you see this idea that the cross and the message of the Christian faith, that we're made in God's image and we're restored to that image, is in every bit of creation. I see his blood upon the rose, and in the stars, the gleaming of his eyes. His body gleams beneath eternal snows. His tears fall from the skies. I see his face in every flower. The thunder and the singing of the birds are but his voice, and carven by his power, rocks are his written words. All pathways by his feet are worn. His strong heart stirs the ever-beating seas. His crown of thorns is twined with every thorn. His cross is every tree. This universe is not made by accident. It's made with an intelligence and a purpose and an intimacy to the whole thing. I think the idea that God is a delusion is itself a submission to the possibility that all of this stuff is an accident. Maybe that is something we ought to reconsider to be the kind of thing that we believe in the face of strong contradictory evidence. But let me now go to the dangerous part so we can get to the Q&A. This is probably the part that's the stickiest of the wickets we're going to be dealing with this evening. Is it dangerous? Years ago, I was 11 years old, and I was going to a pizza shop with my cousin and my brother. My brother was younger than me. My cousin was just a little older than me. So roughly between 9 and 11 years old, this group of boys goes to a pizza shop. And it's one of these pizza shops where you don't sit in it. You just order your pizza and you walk out. Now, we did that. We ordered a pizza. We're on our bikes. We order our pizza. We walk out. And because we're 11-year-old boys, we're inherently disgusting. And so what we decided to do was we walked out of the pizza shop, and there was a trash can with a flat top on it, a flat lid, and we made that our table to eat off of. So I have a healthy immune system now because I generated that immune system from years of eating like that. So we're sitting right outside the pizza shop. I just came from it. I put my pizza on the top of the trash can, and I'm just eating and doing what 11-year-old boys do and what they think about, which is almost nothing. And I'm looking back into the pizza shop I just came from. Now, I'm looking at the glare of the window, and behind me there's a main road, and there's all these cars going by, and I'm just, staring into the glare. But then I see something. I see an image right behind the glare. And it's the guy who literally just gave me my pizza. And he's looking at me like this, and he's got this look of contempt on his face. And he's much older than me, much older. And he's looking at me with this look of contempt on his face, and he's got his finger raised in an obscene gesture at me. Now, I'm shocked. I'm 11 years old. I don't know what I'm looking at. And I have no idea what impelled me to go back into the pizza shop to this much older, much larger guy than me. I walk in to the pizza shop, and I said, in squeaky 11-year-old voice, I said, "Are you doing that to me?" And he said, "That's right, camel jockey. What are you going to do?" Stunned. I just muttered something. I have no idea what I muttered. I muttered it, and I walked out. Some of you know what it's like to feel the sense of degradation, of being made to feel less than just because you're other in some way, and usually because of ethnicity. I had a small taste, a small sampler platter of the thing that many people are forced to eat all the time. And I know how awful it felt. In fact, I'll tell you this, I drive past that pizza shop every so often, and it's been almost 40 years since that happened. And I still have an emotional response to it. There's something about being made to feel less than. You can insult somebody for being dumb. You can insult somebody for making mistakes. You can insult somebody for a lot of things. But for an arbitrary reason, there's this assault on the very personage of that person. And if memory serves correctly, he had a cross around his neck. And I was a Muslim at the time. And that helped to forge my idea of just how tolerant and loving this religious faith seems to be. Whether he wore it for decoration or he meant it, I don't know. I didn't talk to him. Well, we did talk to him. My older uncle and I went back to that store, and things went differently. Anyway, I remember what it was like. And so you see that oftentimes Christianity is like this idea that can be blamed for these ills, these social ills, that people feel this way. And I got the force of that before I became a Christian. But then I began to study the Christian faith. And I began to study the credibility of it from multiple different angles, and I began to see this is a faith worth actually embracing. And in fact, as I studied it, as it is in the book, More Than a White Man's Religion, which I think is going to be available to you guys today as well, as I began to study the most problematic passages of the Bible, the passages that seem to condone slavery and seem to condone ethnicism and us versus them, like we're better because of whatever reason and you're genetically different than us and so you're worse and so we can commit genocides and all these kind of things. I began to study these things actually in earnest. I began to see something, that when you look at these things closely, I am convinced now, and I hope that we can interact on this, that the Bible is actually the Christian message, properly interpreted and understood, is actually the cure for the very things it's being blamed for. You look at slavery, for example. The Bible seems to condone slavery. Now, I want to sort of broad brush this if I could, just because of time. But the reality is, the Bible doesn't actually condone slavery. It describes slavery, and it doesn't prescribe slavery. It describes it in terms of other people owning other people as property. That's chattel slavery. And now I say the word slavery. The first thing you think of is antebellum Southern slavery. It's the first thing you think of. Or the first thing you think of is the transatlantic slave trade. Naturally, you would think of that because that is the most ugly and the most recent version of this horrible scourge of humanity, is the transatlantic slave trade and, of course, antebellum Southern slavery that was abolished and actually done away with after the Civil War. Now, the word slave can mean multiple things, and I don't have time to go into this. In the Bible, it means multiple things because the word actually can mean, the word is oved. Now, my name, Abdu, actually is a Semitic word. It comes because Arabic and Hebrew are both Semitic languages. They share a root. My name actually means slave. My parents weren't making fun of me when they named me that, because it literally means God's slave or God's servant. It can mean servant. It doesn't have to mean slave. It can mean something of an honorific. When you tie yourself to a cause higher than yourself, or you tie yourself to something in order to fulfill an honorable purpose, you can be a slave. One of the prophets of old is called Obed. Obed means slave. Obadiah, his name means slave. You see it all over the place. So it can mean someone who's owned as property, or it can mean someone who's a servant of someone, including a servant of the Most High God. So the word doesn't itself always mean what you think it means. Now, in the Bible, when you see this regulation of so-called slavery, what you're actually seeing is the regulation of servitude, of voluntary indentured servitude. Someone owes someone a debt, they have to pay that off, they can't pay it off, so rather than go into debtor's prison, they actually sell their services to either that person they owe the money to or to another person who ends up paying that person back so that the monetary thing is actually paid. Now, why is that so fundamentally different than Southern antebellum slavery? The reason why it's so fundamentally different is because it's voluntary. In fact, the Bible makes it a punishable by death offense to kidnap a person and bring them into slavery against their will. The Bible also says that if you come across a runaway slave, you cannot return him or her to their master. You have to keep them free. That is exactly the opposite of the Southern runaway slave law. Exactly the opposite. Also, every 7 years, whether your debt is paid off or not, you are required to set the servant free. The master is required to set the servant free, unless the servant says, I want to stay and be employed by you. Every 50 years, on the year of Jubilee, even if the 7 years hasn't come, and it happens to be the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, you get to be set free. What's also fascinating is the Bible specifically says that when a servant is set free, that servant is to be paid, quote, liberally out of the master's money, cattle, and land. Do you know why? so that that servant never falls into servitude again. Now, we're having a debate in this country on reparations and whether that's a good idea or not, and whether the people who are living today are actually responsible for the slavery of yesteryear and all these things. And I'm not about to settle that debate, so don't even try with me. I will tell you this, though. Had, in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, had we looked to the Bible as a standard and said maybe the people who owned those slaves should have been the ones to pay liberally out of their money, their cattle, and their land, maybe those slaves would have gone into the light of freedom, as W.E.B. Du Bois once said, and not found themselves only to find themselves again in the wilderness of slavery. Maybe they'd have something to build upon instead of say, you're free, well, now what? The Bible actually prescribes a way out of that mess in a lesser version of servitude, which is voluntary. So important was this that you look at the Old Testament and you see these wonders of the way in which the Bible actually treats people, not based on their utility as property, but based on their value as human beings, regardless of their ethnicity, because there is no real partiality of ethnicity in the Bible. Now you'll say, yeah, but the Jews are God's chosen people and all these things, and that seems to be something over against other ethnicities that surrounded them. But wait a minute, hold on a second. I want you to notice something. When you read the Bible, what you'll see is that the nation of Israel was often used as an instrument of judgment against other tribes and other clans and other nations, when those other tribes and other nations did horribly abominable things, like child sacrifice, like temple prostitution, like ritual butchering of women as sacrifices to appease their gods, like marauding and other horrible acts like that. Israel was used as an instrument of judgment against those nations in the Bible. What's fascinating is that when Israel herself, the nation Israel herself, succumbed to the same kinds of practices, God used those other nations, those non-Israelite nations, as instruments to judge Israel herself when she committed such practices. In other words, friends, God is not judging people in the Bible based on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. And that phrase ought to sound familiar to you. It's one of the most important phrases, one of the most oft-quoted phrases of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He did not pull that phrase out of the sky. Well, I guess technically he did. He got it from the pages of Scripture. He saw something in the value of every human being based on the pages of Scripture, which inspired him to write those words. In fact, when you look at Jesus' encounter in John chapter 4, with a woman of Samaria. Now, I want to set the stage here. You might know the story, but in case you don't, Jesus comes to Samaria, which is an area that is absolutely avoided by all Jews. Jews hated Samaritans. Samaritans hated them right back. Samaritans were considered like ethnic and religious half-breeds who were looked down upon by the Jews, and the Samaritans had no love in return for the Jews as well. Jesus goes intentionally into Samaria, and he goes to a well. It's Jacob's well. And he comes there, and the boys go out to find food. The disciples go out to find food, and a woman of Samaria comes up in the middle of the day trying to get water. Now, this is important because she's alone, which means that she's a reject, because women didn't travel alone in those days. They either had social reasons or safety reasons for being together in the middle of the day, and she comes by herself, which tells Jesus a whole lot about her. She's a woman of Samaria, which is a rejected area. So she's a reject among rejects. And she comes to this Jewish man and she says, great, not only is he a man, so I'm less than he is, in the sense of I'm a woman and he's a man, but he's also a Jewish man, so I'm less than him ethnically and religiously. So she comes with all of her baggage, and he says, can I have a drink? And she says, how can you, a Jewish man, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? The gender disparity, there's an ethnic disparity, there's a religious disparity. Jesus begins to talk to her and go back and forth with her on her issues, and she's got a lot of chips on her shoulder, and he begins to flick them off one by one as he reveals things about her life and treats her with compassion and care, despite the fact that she's from a different tribe, a tribe that is hated by the Jews and who hate the Jews right back. And he says something to her that's remarkable. She's fixated on the ethnic differences. She's fixated on the gender differences. And he says to her, God doesn't care about where you worship or what ethnicity you might be. Those things are important. They are expressions of who you are. But God is seeking those who worship him in spirit and in truth. He includes the Samaritan woman in the kingdom of God, a woman who is rejected because of her ethnicity and her gender. He includes her. And she gets so excited, she goes back to her village of Sychar and tells all these Samaritans who hate Jews to come and spend 3 days with a Jew they should hate. And they all come to see Jesus as the Savior of the world. Friends, I pause on this story just for a moment here because this is a story. If the Bible were so racist and sexist, you wouldn't expect a Samaritan woman to be the hero of a story. And yet there she is. She's hung up on her ethnic issues. She's hung up on her gender issues. And Jesus says to her, your gender and your ethnicity are important expressions of who you are, but they're not definitional. You being made in God's image defines what you are, and therefore nothing stands in your way of equality. Frederick Douglass, no less a luminary than Frederick Douglass, knew this. He knew this. He knew the difference between the slave-trading, women-whipping, manipulative gospel of the slave traders and the true, honest, and pure gospel of the Christian faith. He knew that they were manipulating this thing to serve their ends. He knew that there was a thing called a slave Bible, a Bible which, by the way, is edited. Exodus is removed from it. All the liberation passages are removed from it because the slave owners knew that the slaves would get a hold of a Bible eventually, and if they read those passages, they would demand their equality. If the Bible was so racist and so sexist and condoned slavery, why edit it? Because it actually commends freedom. Listen to what Douglass says. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love, he says, the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land that ratified slavery Christianity. He saw the difference, and Douglass is one of the most intelligent, insightful, and courageous minds this country has ever produced. He could see the difference. He could see the difference. So much so that Martin Luther King Jr., again himself, said that I refuse to accept the idea that the idols of man's present nature make him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. He referred to an eternal oughtness. In other words, there's a way things ought to be. If there is no God, my friends, then there is no oughtness. There's just human opinion. And we're left to fashion. But if there's a standard by which people are considered valuable, then there is an eternal oughtness. Again, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, some of our most important scientists in the history of the world have pointed out that this oughtness only finds its root in God. That results back now to the issue of sexuality, and I'll spend just a minute on this. You know, there's a lot of rancor going on right now over this issue. And people are feeling like they're being treated as second class or not even real people because of this kind of thing. And I get why that's happening. And you know, there's a reason why this happens. It's because the Bible actually doesn't just prohibit certain conduct because God finds it icky or because dusty old men wrote a dusty old book to baptize their bigotry and they used God to do it. Rather, the Bible explains why sexuality between a man and a woman is so important as limited in that way. And there's a why to that. And I think we've lost our sense of looking at someone else and saying, you know, I disagree, but can I tell you why? What I'd like you to do is hear the why so that you can reject the real thing or accept the real thing as opposed to this caricature I have made of you and you have made of me. All the rancor that's out there right now because we're not listening and we're not understood. Reminds me of Thomas Bracken's poem. Not understood, we move along asunder, our paths grow wider as the seasons creep. Along the years we marvel and we wonder why life is life and then we fall asleep. Not understood. Not understood how many hearts are breaking, how many lowly spirits pass away. Not understood how many breasts are aching. how many noble spirits pass away, not understood. And then he says this phrase. He says, "Oh God, that men would see a little clearer, or at least judge less harshly when they cannot see. Oh God, that men would draw a little nearer to one another, then perhaps they would draw nearer to thee and be understood." Friends, the question of whether Christianity is dangerous and delusional is always a personal question. Yes, it's societal, but it's ultimately personal. And what I want to say to you is this, and what I offer to you is this: the God who sees your sin for what it is and who sees my sin for what it is gives you the dignity of saying your choices have eternal consequences. That's how important your actions are. But he's also the God who says, I value you so much as one made in my image that I'm willing to die on a cross to pay the penalty that you deserve to pay, but I don't want you to pay it, but it's got to be paid, so my son pays it. And that is the equation of justice and mercy, so that you can finally be understood in your sin, but also be understood in your eternal and infinite value. Is the Christian message dangerous? It's been treated that way. But it's dangerous in that it calls us to a higher standard. It calls us to a recognition of something that's beyond us. Is it delusional? I think not. I think the very idea that there's a standard by which to judge delusionalness only makes sense if there's an intelligence behind this entire universe. Friends, what I want to urge you to do as we contemplate these questions together is give this a serious hearing. If you've come to numerous of these and you haven't given your life to Jesus, or if you've come to numerous of these and you've thought about it more, thank you so much for blessing me with your time. Time is the one thing they're not making more of, and you've given me some of it. I hold it in the highest regard that you've given me such a treasure. Thank you, guys. We'll take questions.